Welcome in. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Perfect. Because today we're going deep, really deep into the heart of China's Forbidden City.
Ah, the Forbidden City. So much intrigue, so many secrets.
Exactly. And we love uncovering those hidden corners of history.
Absolutely. It's what these deep dives are all about. What hidden stories are we uncovering this time?
Well, we're diving into a side of palace life that's often whispered about but rarely examined in detail, the lives of women within those walls, and an intriguing practice known as Dui Shi.
Dui Shi.
Ah,
I'm intrigued already. It's not a term you hear every day.
right. It's a topic that really makes you think about relationships, especially within the incredibly restrictive environment of the imperial palace.
I can only imagine. Thousands of women living their entire lives bound by these strict rules, hidden away from the world. Their stories are often overlooked, but they were just as complex and fascinating as any emperor or court official.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to explore today.
So where do we even begin to unravel something like this?
Well, we're lucky enough to have some really intriguing source material for this deep dive. We're working with excerpts from this text, Lun, which, and get this, translates to, how did palace maids in ancient China satisfy their sexual desires?
Wow, okay. They definitely weren't mincing words with that title.
It definitely grabs your attention.
It does. It definitely does. So how does this text approach such a, well, delicate subject?
It's actually surprisingly insightful, I mean, you have to remember the context here. We're talking about thousands upon thousands of young women living within the palace walls, completely separated from the outside world.
Essentially cut off from any life they might have known before entering the palace.
Exactly. Their lives were totally dictated by rules, by hierarchy, by the whims of the emperor. I can't even imagine the pressure they must have felt, the lack of agency, the yearning for something more.
It's a recipe for, well, desperation almost. How did they form bonds, find love, or even just a hint of connection within those suffocating limitations?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's where Dui Shi comes in. The term itself literally means eating together.
Eating together. That sounds almost mundane, given the title of our source material.
Right. But trust me, within the Forbidden City's walls, it took on a much deeper meaning. These weren't just friends grabbing lunch. We're talking relationships that often mirrored marriage vows, lifelong commitments, the whole 9 yards.
Wow. They really built a world within a world, didn't they? Finding ways to create those deep, meaningful connections, even within this incredibly restrictive system.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? I mean, the text even compares these women to birds in gilded cages, surrounded by beauty, luxury, everything they could ever want or need, but ultimately trapped.
That's such a powerful image and so accurate, I imagine.
Right. So did that lack of freedom, that yearning for something more, fuel this desire for deep connection, even if it meant going against the grain of their society? What do you think?
I think it's impossible to separate the two. When you look at the options these women faced, or rather didn't have, Dui Shi starts to make a lot of sense.
Because there really weren't many other options, were there?
Not really, no. Marrying outside the palace? Practically unheard of.
Unless you were incredibly lucky or well-connected.
Even then, it was rare. And relationships with eunuchs, while they certainly happened, the records show that much.
They had their own set of complexities, let's just say.
Exactly. Often burdened by power imbalances and, well, a whole other set of challenges. Dui Shi offered these women something different. It gave them a sliver of agency in a system that was meticulously designed to control every aspect of their lives.
It's a fascinating contradiction, isn't it? This incredibly restrictive system, yet within it, these women found ways to carve out their own spaces, their own forms of connection and intimacy.
It speaks to the resilience of the human spirit, don't you think? That need for connection, for love, for something that transcends the boundaries and limitations placed upon us.
You mentioned power imbalances, though, and it brings to mind a rather unsettling story from our source about a palace woman from the Ming dynasty, Yang Jining. Have you come across her story before?
Vaguely, yes. Wasn't she?
She ended up killing her Dui Shi partner after, and it's difficult to even talk about, but after enduring horrific abuse, it's chilling. And it makes you wonder, how common was this darker side of these relationships?
It's the heartbreaking reality of any relationship, isn't it? When you have power dynamics woven in, the potential for abuse is always present. And sadly, this was no different.
Especially for these women who had, let's face it, next to no support systems, no legal recourse. They were completely at the mercy of the system and of the people within it.
Exactly. The text uses Yang Jinying's story as a stark illustration of the very real dangers they faced. Their lack of agency could, and tragically sometimes did, have life or death consequences.
Right, it adds this whole other layer of complexity to the need for connection, for intimacy. For Dui Shi, it wasn't always a fairy tale romance, was it? Sometimes it was about survival.
Absolutely. And it's a side of the story that's often ignored,
Oh,
romanticized.
we're all about keeping it real in these deep dives.
Always. Unvarnished truth. That's what we're after.
Exactly. But this wasn't exactly a hush-hush topic back then, was it? The source mentions that same-sex relationships were recorded as far back as the Han Dynasty. There's even that story of Emperor A and Dongxin, the Passion of the Cut Sleeve. Have you heard of that one?
Oh, yes. It's a classic tale of devotion, although perhaps a bit unconventional.
To say the least.
But it does make you wonder, does this indicate a broader acceptance of different kinds of relationships back then, at least within the confines of the palace walls?
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? Was the Forbidden City its own world with its own unique set of rules and social norms?
I think it's safe to say that the palace was unlike any other place in China at the time. The emperor's story with Dongxin, it's definitely unique, given his power and the lengths he went to for love.
He was the emperor, after all. He could do what he wanted.
True enough. But it does highlight something important, the potential for profound emotional depth in these relationships, a depth that was probably amplified within the isolating world of the palace.
So we're talking about the Forbidden City as almost its own contained society, with its own unique rules, its own social codes.
Exactly. And those codes, those relationships, they were always being tested, redefined, reinterpreted. It's what makes this whole period so fascinating to explore.
We've talked about the risks, the dangers, the secrecy surrounding Dui Shi, but it wasn't always about, well, just survival, right? Some of these relationships blossomed into really powerful, enduring love stories.
Absolutely. And some of them even found their way into classic Chinese literature and poetry, which is how we even know about this practice today.
It's true. The stories that survived, the ones deemed acceptable enough to be told and retold, they give us a glimpse into this hidden world.
Exactly. And we can't talk about love stories in the Forbidden City without mentioning Emperor Xuanzong and Yang Guifei from the Tang Dynasty, right?
Definitely not. I mean, their love story is legendary.
Tragic, too. But their story is a perfect example of how, even within a system as rigid and restrictive as the imperial palace, love could find a way.
Our source even mentions the Song of Everlasting Regret, that famous poem dedicated to their romance. Have you read it?
Of course, it's heartbreaking. It captures the depth of their love, the tragedy of their separation.
It's interesting, though, because Yang Guifei, she was a concubine, right? Not technically a palace maid like we've been discussing.
That's true, she was. But her story still offers some valuable insight into the lives of women in the palace, even those who reach the upper echelons of society.
Because even with her elevated status, she was still ultimately subject to the whims of the emperor.
Exactly. Her life, her loves, they were very much dictated by his desires.
It's a good reminder that for women in the Forbidden City, true agency in matters of love and marriage was incredibly rare, no matter how high they climbed within that hierarchy.
It's a sobering thought, isn't it? The limitations they faced.
It is. But even within this incredibly restrictive system, the sources reveal these fascinating details, about the palace women finding ways to connect with the outside world.
You mean like those stories about the Kaihu?
Yes, the Kaihu, those are the vegetable vendors, right? The ones who had access to the world beyond the palace walls.
Right. They were kind of like a lifeline for some of those women, weren't they?
They were. And think about it, these women risked their lives just to hear a whisper of what lay beyond those walls, a glimpse of a different life.
It makes you wonder what they were searching for, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What drove them to take such risks?
Was it purely about escaping the confines of the palace? Or was there something more to it?
I think it was a bit of both, don't you? A longing for freedom, for a taste of something different.
And remember, not every Dui Shi relationship was about romantic love, was it? The sources make it clear that sometimes it was about finding a friend.
A confidant. Someone who understood what it was like to live within those walls. Someone they could truly be themselves with.
Someone who could offer a different perspective, some news from the outside world. Someone who could offer intellectual stimulation, or even just a moment of companionship.
These women were starved for agency, weren't they? And any interaction with the outside world, even with the Kaihu, as risky as it gave them a taste of that.
It was like they were creating these tiny windows to a world they were forbidden from experiencing.
Exactly. taking control, forging connections on their own terms in an environment meticulously designed to strip them of their individuality and autonomy.
Which makes the whole concept of Dui Shi that much more significant, wouldn't you say?
Without a doubt, it's a testament to the power of human connection, even in the most oppressive of circumstances.
It's a reminder that even when everything seems hopeless, people will always find a way to create their own spaces, their own forms of love and support.
Exactly. It reminds us that history is about so much more than just emperors and dynasties.
It's about the lives of everyday people and the extraordinary things they do to survive, to connect, to find meaning in a world that often seems determined to deny them that.
I love that. We should put that on a t-shirt. History. It's about more than just emperors.
We totally should. But seriously, the practice of Dui Shi, it really challenges us to reconsider what we think we know about love, about relationships, about agency.
It does. Because here were these women living with such limited choices, yet they found ways to forge their own paths, to create meaningful bonds that defied the rigid norms of their society.
It makes you question everything, what we consider conventional, what we consider acceptable.
It reminds us that love, connection, intimacy, those are fundamental human needs, and they can't be suppressed even by the most oppressive systems.
It's like stepping back in time, trying to imagine the lives of these women, their hopes, their dreams, the things they whispered about in the dead of night.
Secrets those callous walls could tell, right?
Exactly. It makes you realize that history isn't just dates and battles and emperors. It's about real people living their lives, trying to find their own ways to connect, to love, to simply exist within these incredibly complex systems.
And those stories, those personal stories, those are often the ones that resonate the most, don't they?
They do, because they remind us that even in the most extraordinary of circumstances, human beings are still, well, human. We crave connection. We crave intimacy.
We search for ways to create meaning in a world that often feels chaotic and beyond our control.
And Dui Shi, it embodies that perfectly, doesn't it? It's
Yeah.
not just some salacious footnote in a history book. It's a testament to the human need for connection, for something more.
It was a way for these women to find solace, to find support, to find love, even in a system that attempted to control every aspect of their existence. They were resilient.
And resourceful. I mean, think about it. They had to be to survive, let alone find moments of joy or connection within those walls.
Absolutely. And their stories, they challenge us to examine our own preconceived notions about love, about relationships, about agency. What does it even mean to have agency when your entire world is confined to a palace?
It's a question worth pondering, isn't it? Because here we are, centuries later, still grappling with those same questions about freedom, about choice, about the right to love who we love, how we love.
Exactly. And Dewey Shi, it underscores the timelessness of those human needs, those desires, that deep-seated yearning for intimacy, for someone to share your life with.
For a connection that runs deeper than the roles we're assigned or the circumstances we find ourselves in.
Precisely. And by unearthing these hidden stories, by bringing them to light, we gain a richer, I think, a more nuanced understanding of the past.
And maybe even a better understanding of ourselves. We see ourselves reflected in their stories.
And hopefully we learn from their struggles, their triumphs, their resilience.
Because if these women could find ways to carve out their own spaces, to create their own forms of love and connection within the confines of the Forbidden City, imagine what we can achieve, right?
Now you're talking. It's
Yeah.
all about perspective, isn't it? We can choose to be inspired by these stories. We can choose to see them as reminders that even in the darkest of times, even in the most restrictive of circumstances, the human spirit will always find a way to shine through.
To find those glimmers of hope, those moments of connection that make life worth living.
Exactly. It's about finding those connections, holding on to them, and never ever taking them for granted.
And on that note, another deep dive comes to an end. Until next time.
Keep exploring those hidden corners.